Hey everyone, welcome to Crank It Up Podcast, the YouTube home of Brigand Games. I'm Jim Price, and this is my first designer diary for our upcoming game Erudia, Battle of Birthrights, which is a 2-player fantasy card game coming to Kickstarter in 2021. We're really excited about Erudia, and we wanted to share a little bit of the creative process through these designer diaries to let you know a little bit more about the game and to help build up excitement for it. For today's topic, I wanted to talk about Final Fantasy, one of the primary inspirations for this game. As I've mentioned in other posts, Erudia is inspired by classical JRPGs, and there are a number of them, but the Final Fantasy series is first and foremost. Today I'll be talking about 3 different ways and 3 different games that the series has inspired us. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what Final Fantasy means to me personally as a series. I am a huge fan of this series. I have played most of the games. Admittedly, I haven't been able to keep up as much in recent years, but then again, they haven't been putting out nearly the same level of quality that they had in the past. If you grew up in the 90s, or if you're very familiar with video games, you know that this is one of the most influential series in the genre overall. I would put it as the highest influential series that wasn't made by Nintendo. I think, unfortunately, the Mario games, the Zelda games, and the Pokemon games probably have had a little bit more of an impact, but from an RPG standpoint, this is easily the most influential. Probably the high would have been Final Fantasy VII for them, even though I think Final Fantasy X is a fantastic game. It's my favorite of the group. 10-2 being the absolute worst game I've ever played. It's an abomination compared to 10, but don't get me started on that. But there are 3 main games that stand out in the series with respect to Erudia, and those would be Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy VI, and Final Fantasy Tactics, all of which influenced the game in different ways. The first one I wanted to talk about was actually Final Fantasy VI, because it helped inspire the theme, and because the theme is so integrated into the mechanics, it really just starts there. When I first conceived Erudia, which was known by different names, one of which was Birthright, we've used several videos where we called it that, we've since changed the names. It originally was a game that, for lack of a better name, was called Avatar. And it was based in the VR space, sort of a cyberspace. You know, you're downloading yourself, you're downloading your conscious into a cyber arena. And there were multiple reasons why I decided not to go forward with that theme. But the biggest one is the fact that I'm not really passionate about it. And for my first project, I wanted to make sure that this is something that I was passionate about and that the passion would shine through the design. While I like that, and it's certainly my background because my background is in software engineering, I wouldn't say that, I salivate over it or that I really want, to work in that area. But fantasy has always been something that's really important to me. And I know that there's a lot of fantasy games, and people will say that, there's tons of generic fantasy. Well, this isn't one of them. No, when I was thinking about things that I'm passionate about, including this series, I was thinking about part of the story from Final Fantasy VI. If you're familiar with the game, you know that there are 2 brothers, Sabin and Edgar, who are both, in line for the throne of Figaro. And as the story goes, Sabin doesn't really want it, but part of him feels like he needs to have it. And so Edgar comes up with this clever solution to let Sabin have his freedom without really making a big deal over it. And he decides to flip a coin. And, whoever wins the coin toss is going to be the next king. Sabin, again, does not want the throne, and he loses the coin toss, and he's very glad to go have his freedom. But then you find out that Edgar actually flipped a 2-headed coin, cheating in order to give his brother the freedom without making it a complicated situation. And that way, Edgar is kind of making the sacrifice. And it's always been interesting, especially because the 2-headed coin comes into play later in the game, but it's also very convenient and not lifelike at all. I started to wonder, what if there wasn't an easy way out of that situation? What if you had 2 brothers who both desperately wanted the throne? And what if there was something more, there was mutual respect between the brothers, but in Erudia, there's not. We went with the opposite direction. It actually tells the story of 2 brothers who can't stand each other. The tagline being, born as brothers, raised as rivals. Because that's precisely what the father did, raising them as rivals, knowing that only one of them could inherit the throne, and wanting it to naturally be the stronger one, believing that pitting the 2 brothers against each other would produce the better successor. This, of course, is a terrible plan for succession, but it is the succession that they had nonetheless. And so you have two brothers who are truly rivals, and this is reflected in the game's design as a two-player game. A lot of times people will ask, why would you make a two-player only game? Why wouldn't you make it 2 to 4, 2 to 5, etc.? Aren't you eliminating part of the market? While there are some truths to that, the other truth is that you're actually treating for another market, for the strong two-player market, people who are looking specifically for games that shine at 2 players. And by limiting it to 2 players, there's a lot that we can do about that I'll talk about in a separate video. But you'll see this in the cards because it's not talking about other players with respect to the other player in the game. It's not talking about the other player. All the cards strictly say your rival. The card itself is integrating the lore of the game, knowing that that really is the only way to describe the other player, the person that you can't stand, the person that you are actively competing against. So when you start with the theme of 2 brothers who hate each other, vying for the kingdom, you need to understand, well, why are they hiring armies in the first place? How are they constructing the armies that they're going to be hiring? It all flows down from that initial inspiration of Final Fantasy VI. Now we talk about the mechanics, which is where Final Fantasy V starts to come into the situation. The Final Fantasy series in the United States has a little bit of a weird history. When I was younger, I played Final Fantasy I played 2, and then I played 3. Then I started to play Final Fantasy II, which is really odd, because I played 2, but 2 looked better and it was new, and then I would soon realize that in the United States, Final Fantasy II is actually Final Fantasy IV, and Final Fantasy III is 6. So what happened to 3, what happened to 2, what happened to 5? Well, that's a long story, but emulation fortunately was a thing. And I was able to play the older Final Fantasy games, one of which was 5, and this is drastically different from the others because it created something called the job system. This is something that we wear on our sleeve with the Erudia design. We call them classes because it's a little bit more of a common term you'll see in Ogre Battle or in D&D or in other related games. But it's still the job system nonetheless. What Final Fantasy V did in such a clever way was that you had this idea of the primary class and then a lower secondary class. So you could be a knight, for example, but you could have thief elements. You can be a white mage with black mage elements. This would be different from being a black mage with white mage elements. It made you think about how to construct your character very carefully. What would be the best optimization? Is a little bit of offensive magic with a little bit of defensive magic sprinkled in better than a lot of defense with a little bit of offense? There was so much replayability that came for that, and I loved Final Fantasy V as a result. I played it, I've lost track of how many times. It's got to be at least 6. Wouldn't surprise me if it's much more, and I'm due to play it again. But with the diversity of the job classes and the fact that you can combine them, there was so much design space there that, the cards started to basically write themselves when you view, all right, in the context of the rules of the game, what would these various jobs/classes do? And that's why we could proudly say that even though the core set is shipping with 8 primary and 4 secondary, we have plans for over 50 unique classes. And that's something that's really excited about. But so much of them actually come straight from the Final Fantasy jobs. When you take something like the Chemist class, Chemist in Final Fantasy has very particular meanings. How are we going to reflect that in Erudia? I think we found a really good way to honor that while still putting a unique spin on the idea of that you have random effects created when you combine items, typically in unexpected ways unless you had a strategy guide. Chemists are great in that regard because you'll see with their cards, there are certain baseline cards that they have, and then they have ways of combining them for bigger and bigger explosions or some new effects as a result as well. So with Final Fantasy V, when I'm thinking about all the jobs that they have available, the first thing you want to do is you want to write down, okay, what were all the jobs? What would work in the fantasy setting? What wouldn't? What would we want to do with them? It just naturally starts running the game very much. But we need to think about, all right, what are we going to do in order to make the game feel right? If we have the theme that's in place from Final Fantasy VI, and we have the overall design from Final Fantasy V, where's the execution going to lie? And that's coming from Final Fantasy Tactics. Final Fantasy Tactics is an incredibly difficult game. I can't believe it. I don't know how I used to play it because I tried to play it recently and I keep dying. But it's still fun, and if I had more time, I definitely would put in the grinding. You want the tactical feel of Final Fantasy Tactics, but without the grinding, because grinding is not a concept that really exists in a board game, nor should it, because it's not a very good one. So how do you honor Final Fantasy Tactics? When you think about it, it's very methodical. You can't just run up to the enemy and start bashing them. You're probably going to die as a result, because they can hurt you a lot more than you can hurt them. So you have to think about the pacing very carefully. And this is actually really good for the type of board game that Erudia is. One of the things that we look at very carefully is the number of turns per game. If the turn count is consistent, it means that regardless of how you're approaching it, your engine that you're trying to create is given enough time to actually fire meaningfully, because it is, in many aspects, an engine game, even though it plays out as an area control game. One of the common criticisms of an engine game is that it takes too long for your engine to start, and by the time it's doing it, the game is over. With Erudia, what we wanted that short-term, mid-term, long-term style goals that you get from engine-style games paced appropriately. And when you think about Final Fantasy Tactics, one of the ways that they do that is the idea of, progression and attacking one area at each time. If there's clusters of enemies, you want to go here, take care of it. You want to go here, take care of it. And you want to make sure that you're saving enough of your abilities over the course of the game. And like I said, we wear this on our sleeve, through the uses of the charges, which are the one-time ability, through the idea of the recurring abilities that, you'll get for as much as you can, but then those will go away. But most importantly, the idea of, if you want to be good at Final Fantasy Tactics, you need to have something that you can do on every turn, even if it's not a good one. So many times I would advance forward as much as I can and hope to throw a stone at somebody. It may not be the greatest attack in the world, but it'll deal a little bit of damage, I'll get a little bit of XP, and I'll make sure that I'm positioned for striking distance on the next time. I'm advancing very carefully. When you view the tactics system, which we're calling that intentionally, the idea that you always have something to do on your turn, it would be bad if you don't. It means that you have to think about, all right, what can I accomplish now versus what can I accomplish later? All right, maybe I don't want to just run up and throw a bunch of power on the battlefield, because then it's going to get captured very quickly by your opponent. Maybe I want to go there and I want to defend. That's something that you would do routinely, is that you might advance a little bit and defend. We have that through the shields. I'm going to place a unit, but I'm going to make it so that they're going to be harder to destroy, because I don't want to lose my presence on that battlefield. That tactical feeling is our attempt at trying to recreate the tactical experience in board game form, which is always going to be difficult, but I'm really proud of the way that it all came together. So what I'm hoping to show you with this diary is that these games that have been so influential, we've decided to bake them into the core identity of the game and use them in a way that is certainly honoring the legacy, but doing it in a new way that would really appeal to board gamers, because there are certain things you just can't do on a board game, like a lot of calculations. But we can mimic the pacing, we can mimic the feel, we can mimic the jobs, and create something as a result that's really exciting. So that's our first designer diary for Erudia Battle of Birthrights. I hope that you enjoyed it. We'll be showing a lot more about the game over the coming weeks. Please subscribe to our channel and make sure to check out Brigand Games on either Facebook or Instagram for special sneak peeks of cards or art. Thanks so much for watching. Let's shut it down.